Well, those on the Conservative side of the party don't appear to be totally satisfied either. New South Wales Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells is strongly in favour of protecting religious freedoms, but thinks there needs to be a much broader reform of the nation's discrimination laws. She joined me a short time ago.
We went to the last federal election and we said that we would protect religious freedom, and of course let's not forget that at the last federal election the issue of religious freedom reared its head as a consequence primarily of what happened in the Israel-Folau matter. And so there was a perception, particularly in areas of southwestern Sydney, culturally diverse areas, religiously diverse areas, that the coalition was better placed to protect religious freedom. And I know that many people voted for the coalition on that basis. And indeed, when one compares the swings that happened in those areas to the votes that were obtained during the time of the same-sex marriage postal survey, then it's very, very clear that there is a correlation between those two.
Okay, so politically you're saying there is an imperative for the coalition to follow through on its promise, given the experience of the previous election. But what is it sort of tangibly? I mean, what is it that people of faith fear that they can't say or do right now without, falling foul of anti-discrimination laws?
Look, Jane, if I can encapsulate it in this form, at the kitchen table, if I can put it that way, at the last federal election, I broke it down to a concern, a fear that if I quoted my Bible, will that get me into trouble? And if it can happen to somebody like Israel Folau, will it happen to me? And so therefore, now the test here is what those faith leaders will tell their congregations now and say, yes, your religious freedoms have been protected. So that is ultimately the test. What I think, or what commentators like yourself may or may not say, is really not the issue here. The test will ultimately be what those faith leaders, particularly at the grassroots, preach to their congregations, and the assurances that they will give those congregations that their religious freedom has been protected. And ultimately, I think that that is the test.
And do you think that this is anything more than, genuinely held fears or concerns? There are actually examples in Australia of people being punished for expressing their genuinely held religious views.
Well, Jane, you just have to look at the cases that are before different tribunals, and they are ongoing, and I've spoken about some of those in the Senate. But the reality is that there is a plethora of state discrimination legislation, and now on top of, and we also have discrimination law at a federal level, so on top of this we're now introducing another discrimination law. I have strongly advocated for long-term reform in this area, a consolidation of discrimination law, so that when we are talking about freedom of speech, of freedom of thought, of freedom of conscience, of which freedom of religion is a component, and bearing in mind the international obligations that we have, the time has come for there to be a move away from this silo approach, and let's seriously do some reform in this area, and let's look at a consolidation of discrimination law in this country so that you can have rights, equality of rights, sitting alongside each other, so that in any given circumstance, managing and balancing those rights will be dealt with on what is reasonable in those circumstances. So if those rights sit equally against each other, then of course the test would become what is reasonable in the circumstances. And I actually believe that long term that would ensure that there is greater equality of rights and a better situation that's not going to have as much recourse to the courts and tribunals.
And do you think the legislation as it stands will actually do that?
No, I don't.
So what's wrong with it?
No, I don't. What I'm saying is that a consolidation of discrimination law would require work with the states and territories.
So you want the states to do that in this case, to eventually get rid of their own anti-discrimination laws and defer all those powers to a federal?
What I'm saying is, because that will give us you won't have you will have national applicability of laws. You will have a clear an unambiguous situation. You won't have this question over overriding a state power overriding whether this is appropriate in the circumstances, whether there's a constitutional issue here. So yes, that is major reform, but I think ultimately, Jane, that is the only way that we are going to guarantee that rights, whether they be of thought, of speech, of race, of any other form of discrimination, are dealt with on an equal footing.
Okay, well, looking at the bill that is before us, Equality Australia Chief Executive Anna Brown has said it will compromise access to judgment-free healthcare and inclusive workplaces. A lot of the criticism has been around schools. So under the legislation that is going into Parliament, can a religious school, for example, fire a teacher based on their sexuality?
Well, Jane, this is one of the issues, and of course, like you, I've just seen the bill and I'm working my way through it. But one thing that I think is going to be very necessary here is the Senate process. My point is that we need now a constructive Senate process that's going to go through and look at all of these issues. But as I said before, ultimately, Jane, whether the rights, those rights in those circumstances are appropriately balanced is now a situation where you've got one piece of legislation over here, another piece of legislation over here, then you've got state legislation. So how do you find the appropriate avenue through all of that quagmire to ensure that the rights of those persons who are involved in that particular situation sit on equal footing, and they are, before the law, going to be afforded equality of rights? That's really where I'm coming from.
Okay, I just want to ask you, just before we finish, on a couple of other issues. On China, is it useful for our Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, to be openly talking about a war with China in the context of America going to war with China over Taiwan?
Well, Jane, I have, over quite a number of years ago, I think everyone knows, I was quite prescient in my warnings about the activities of the communist regime, especially in the Pacific. And I have to say that I feel that my position has been fully vindicated. The reality is that China is not a good international citizen. Its bellicose and illegal activities in the South China Sea, its actions in Hong Kong, and most especially its aggressive stance towards Taiwan, mean that it is probably likely that there will be confrontation. Now, of course, we will need to adequately respond. I have been a staunch advocate of freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, and I believe that we should have been working with our allies to ensure that those sea lanes remain open and that the bellicose and illegal actions of China are confronted, are called out at every opportunity.
We have Peter Dutton as the Defence Minister openly talking about war with China, our biggest trading partner, notwithstanding all of the issues that you've laid out with your relationship. Is that useful or helpful?
Well, the Defence Minister is articulating I support what the Defence Minister is saying. As I've said, for many years I have been warning about China's activities. The reality is that China has been aggressively prosecuting its agenda, an agenda which is illegal and bellicose in the South China Sea. There was a ruling in 2016 by the International Court of Arbitration that said clearly that China's activities, particularly in relation to its building up and militarisation of the South China Sea, was illegal. But notwithstanding that ruling, China has ignored that ruling and continued to prosecute a very aggressive stance in the South China Sea. And I believe that ultimately, in relation to Taiwan, there is no doubt that it's the preparatory work that China is currently doing. One only has to look at every day we see evidence of that, and so I fully support the stance that the Defence Minister is taking on this issue.
All right, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Jane.